In the late 1930s, as the storm clouds of another global conflict gathered over Europe and Asia, the United States Army remained a small, conservative force still shaped by doctrines and assumptions carried over from World War I. Its infantry officers were trained to fight set-piece battles, to operate in dense formations, and to follow orders that flowed strictly from the top down. Fort Benning, the infantry school of the U.S. Army, the institution responsible for shaping nearly every lieutenant who would lead men in the next war, reflected these outdated ideas. Training emphasized rigid discipline, rote memorization of regulations, and obedience to authority. Tactical exercises were slow, predictable, and heavily scripted. Officers learned to wait for instructions, not to seize initiative. Entire classes of future leaders graduated believing that war would unfold like a textbook. The battalion attacks here, the regiment maneuvers there. Artillery fires on pre-planned grids, and junior officers simply execute. It was a system designed to avoid mistakes rather than encourage creativity. But beyond America's shores, this approach was already dying. The German Wehrmacht had demonstrated in Poland and France that modern warfare demanded speed, flexibility, and rapid decision-making at the smallest levels. Their doctrine, Auftragstaktik, the mission-type order, empowered low-ranking officers and NCOs to exploit fleeting opportunities rather than wait for direction. German infantry companies outmaneuvered larger opponents because every lieutenant and sergeant understood the commander's intent and acted independently to achieve it. Meanwhile, America's army, starved of funding and stuck in intellectual stagnation, remained chained to a centralized model in which decisions traveled slowly up and down a chain of command that could not possibly react quickly enough in a fast-moving war. Into this brittle structure stepped George C. Marshall, appointed Deputy Chief of Staff in 1938 and Chief of Staff in September 1939. Marshall had spent the interwar years studying the shortcomings of the American expeditionary forces in World War I. He knew exactly where they had failed: staff rigidity, poor communication, slow maneuver, and an officer corps trained to carry out orders but not to think. When he toured Fort Benning in the late 1930s, he saw an infantry school producing polite, obedient officers who would likely be slaughtered in the next war. War, Marshall believed, was no longer a matter of mass formations and slow advances. It was becoming decentralized, fluid, and brutally fast. Radio communications were improving, mechanization was accelerating, and enemy forces would strike from multiple directions simultaneously. The difference between victory and annihilation often depended on whether a platoon leader could make a life-or-death decision in 10 seconds instead of waiting 10 minutes for permission. Marshall understood something revolutionary. The U.S. Army did not need more officers who followed orders. It needed officers who could think, adapt, and decide, men capable of independent action the moment chaos broke out. But Fort Benning was not yet built for such officers. In 1939, its teachings resembled a classroom more than a battlefield. Tactical problems were solved on paper. Maneuvers were carefully choreographed affairs where outcomes were known in advance. Officers practiced moving in straight lines across open fields, the same way their predecessors had marched across France in 1918. The emphasis was on avoiding mistakes, not on building judgment. Worst of all, junior officers were never placed under stress. They were never forced to make rapid decisions with incomplete information. They were never taught how to take initiative when cut off from higher command. Many officers left Benning believing that a war could be run by perfect staff work rather than fast-thinking platoon leaders. Marshall saw all of this and decided it needed to be torn down. Before he could reform the entire army, he had to reform its brain. And Fort Benning, the place where America's infantry leaders were manufactured, would become his laboratory. He quietly began installing reformers, men like General Leslie J. McNair, General Courtney Hodges, and Colonel Omar Bradley, officers who had themselves grown frustrated with stagnant doctrine and who believed that infantry combat in the next war would require bold leadership at the company, platoon, and even squad levels. They were not interested in producing officers who waited for orders. They wanted officers who could issue their own orders. Marshall's early notes in the Marshall Papers reveal his frustration with how slowly young officers made decisions during exercises. He wrote that a lieutenant should be able to decide in seconds, not minutes. He believed that battlefield momentum depended on small unit leaders acting instantly. Delay was deadly, initiative was life, and Fort Benning, as it existed in 1939, could not produce such leaders. The inertia extended deeper. The pre-war Army had almost no culture of after-action critique. Officers rarely analyzed their mistakes. They were encouraged to maintain appearances rather than learn. Marshall despised this culture. He wanted officers who would ruthlessly examine their failures, correct their errors, and grow stronger after every exercise. He believed that humility and adaptability were more valuable than rigid perfection. To produce such officers, Fort Benning had to abandon its old identity entirely. So before World War II even reached America, Marshall began pushing Fort Benning towards a radical transformation. No more scripted problems, no more slow, predictable maneuvers, no more waiting for battalion orders. The infantry school would be rebuilt to simulate the speed, chaos, and ferocity of real combat, forcing young leaders to make decisions with almost no guidance. It was a revolution that would soon ripple outward across the entire U.S. Army. And as the coming war would prove, this transformation would create the fastest reacting small unit leaders of the entire conflict. The secret behind America's lightning counterattacks did not begin on a battlefield. It began in the classrooms and training fields of Fort Benning, before any soldier fired a shot. When George C. Marshall became Chief of Staff in September 1939, he moved with a clarity and urgency that stunned the old guard. He understood something that almost no American officer of the interwar period grasped. Modern war would be decided not by divisions or corps, but by the split-second decisions of lieutenants and sergeants scattered across dozens of unpredictable, fast-moving battlefields. Germany had already proven this with lightning victories in Poland and France. Their success did not come from superior numbers or better equipment. It came from initiative, from junior leaders who understood their commander's intent so well that they could adapt instantly when plans collapsed. Marshall intended to build an American version of that philosophy, but bigger, faster, and far more flexible. And he would forge it at Fort Benning. The first step of Marshall's revolution was intellectual. He removed instructors who clung to World War I doctrine and replaced them with officers who believed in mission-type orders, fast maneuver, and aggressive battlefield decision-making. He elevated Colonel Omar Bradley to assistant commandant of the infantry school, knowing Bradley possessed the calm discipline and analytical mind needed to redesign the Army's leadership culture. Marshall told his staff that the U.S. Army could not afford officers who hesitated. If a lieutenant cannot decide, he said, his platoon will die waiting. The new Benning Doctrine would make hesitation obsolete. Under Marshall and Bradley, Fort Benning training was rebuilt from the ground up. Old classroom lectures were thrown out and replaced with field-driven problem-solving. Instead of reading about tactics, lieutenants were marched into the woods, told the general intent of a mission, and forced to figure out the plan themselves. They had to move quickly, communicate under pressure, adjust routes when terrain betrayed them, and continue the mission even when cut off from higher command. Instructors began deliberately disrupting exercises, removing radios, simulating commander casualties, or changing enemy positions mid-mission to see whether junior officers could adapt on the spot. Chaos was no longer the enemy. Chaos became the teacher. One of the radical changes was the elevation of the non-commissioned officer corps. Marshall believed NCOs were the backbone of any army, yet the pre-war U.S. Army treated them as little more than senior enlisted technicians. At the reformed Fort Benning, NCOs were trained to run squads independently, to coordinate fire and movement, and to take over platoons if officers fell. This mirrored the German practice, but with an American twist. U.S. NCOs received far more formal schooling, including map reading, maneuver coordination, and live-fire leadership drills. By 1942, a well-trained American sergeant could handle situations that would have required an officer in most other armies. The next pillar of the Benning Revolution was realistic fire and maneuver. Marshall insisted that training must reflect battlefield conditions as closely as safety would allow. This led to the expansion of live-fire assault courses, combined arms problem sets, and situational tactics that forced platoons and companies to think in terms of suppressive fire, bounding movement, flank attacks, and rapid exploitation. Gone were the rigid firing lines and slow advances of World War I.
In their place, Fort Benning produced leaders who thought in three dimensions: front, flank, depth, and time. Perhaps the most influential innovation was the sand table exercise, a tool that allowed officers to rehearse tactics visually before executing them in the field. It taught them to visualize terrain, anticipate enemy counteractions, and communicate intent clearly to subordinates. These sand table drills became central to U.S. small unit operations from North Africa to the Pacific. But the real genius of the Benning Doctrine lay in its emphasis on speed. Every exercise, every drill, every critique was designed to shorten the decision cycle of junior leaders. Officers were not graded on whether they chose the ideal tactical solution, only on whether they made a timely one. It was better to attack quickly with an 80% plan than to delay for perfection. Marshall and Bradley hammered this point into the curriculum. Momentum wins battles. Delay kills soldiers. To reinforce this mindset, instructors used rapid-fire critiques. After-action reviews were brutally honest, but focused on improvement rather than punishment. Lieutenants learned to absorb criticism quickly, adjust, and execute again. Marshall believed that self-correction was the highest form of discipline. Under his doctrine, the American infantry officer became adaptable, confident, and unafraid to take responsibility. The final stage of the revolution was cultural. Fort Benning began producing a new breed of leader, men who saw uncertainty not as a threat but as an opportunity. Officers were taught to push responsibility downward, to empower squads and platoons, and to communicate simple, flexible orders rooted in intent rather than rigid instructions. This created a decentralized, fast-moving organizational culture uniquely suited to the demands of World War II. By 1941, just as the United States edged closer to war, Fort Benning had become the nerve center of Marshall's transformation. It was no longer a quiet interwar school, but the most dynamic leadership institution in the country. And once American troops began deploying overseas, the world would see how this revolution, born on dusty training fields in Georgia, would reshape every battlefield the U.S. Army touched. The secret behind America's lightning counterattacks was no longer theoretical. It was being embedded into every platoon leader and company commander graduating from Fort Benning, ready to be tested in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and beyond.
When American troops first entered combat in North Africa in late 1942, the U.S. Army discovered brutally quickly that war did not care about theory, pride, or pre-war assumptions. The Battle of Kasserine Pass exposed every weakness the old Army still carried: slowed decision cycles, poor coordination between platoons and companies, rigid chains of command, and an almost complete inability to counterattack under pressure. German forces under Rommel struck fast, hit hard, and exploited every hesitation. American units fought bravely but reacted too slowly. They waited for orders that came too late. They maneuvered in straight lines instead of adapting to terrain. They relied on commanders who were overwhelmed by chaos and could not push responsibility downward. Kasserine was a painful wake-up call, but it also proved the necessity of Marshall's Fort Benning reforms. Because while some units collapsed, others, those whose officers had already absorbed the new Benning Doctrine, fought differently. They moved with initiative. They acted without waiting for orders. They launched small-scale counterattacks within minutes, not hours. Intelligence teams and officers observed this contrast closely, feeding the information back to Marshall, Bradley, and McNair. The verdict was clear. The units with Benning-trained leadership were surviving because they were faster. After Kasserine, Eisenhower and Bradley doubled down on Fort Benning principles, purging incompetent commanders and promoting officers whose reflexes matched the new doctrine: think fast, maneuver fast, decide fast. The transformation became visible immediately in the last phase of the Tunisian campaign. At El Guattar, U.S. infantry platoons and companies, led by officers who embraced initiative, counterattacked German probes within minutes. They no longer waited for perfect alignment of battalions or artillery grids. Instead, small units flanked, pressed, and re-seized lost ground with a tempo that Germans did not expect from an army that had looked so paralyzed at Kasserine. German POW interrogations reveal their astonishment. The Americans now counterattacked before we established positions. And then came Sicily, the true proving ground. Operation Husky, July 1943, unfolded across mountainous terrain ideal for German delaying tactics. The expectation among Allied planners, based on British experience in North Africa, was that progress would be slow, grinding, and heavily dependent on brigade-level maneuver. But the U.S. Army's advance across Sicily shocked both Allies and Axis. The reason was simple.
Small unit leaders made rapid decisions at every choke point. A German blocking position that would have stalled a conventional army for half a day was often bypassed or flanked by a single U.S. platoon acting independently. Examples filled after-action reports. At Gila, when German counterattacks threatened the beachhead, small American infantry detachments reacted within minutes, maneuvering without orders to intercept panzer thrusts. At Troina, one of the island's toughest mountain battles, U.S. platoons performed independent fire and maneuver sequences across jagged ridges, forcing German Gebirgsjägers to pull back faster than expected. At Nishemi and Butera, American companies executed rapid, decentralized assaults against fortified hills by dividing into self-directed maneuver elements, a hallmark of the Benning system. The Germans noticed. In multiple interrogations from the Hermann Göring Division and 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, officers repeatedly commented on the unexpected speed of American reactions, especially at night and under fire. They were accustomed to American units pausing, waiting for orders and reorganizing, behaviors typical of 1942 Tunisia. But the U.S. Army of mid-1943 was different. It had begun fighting like a decentralized network instead of a rigid hierarchy. Where did that come from? Fort Benning. Nearly every officer leading platoons and companies in Sicily had gone through the new Benning curriculum between 1940 and 1943. They had been drilled, sometimes ruthlessly, in battlefield decision-making under conditions of stress and uncertainty. They had rehearsed situations where radios died, commanders were killed, terrain shifted, and missions changed mid-operation. On Sicilian hillsides, those lessons came alive. Officers didn't freeze when plans fell apart. They improvised. They delegated. They counterattacked instantly rather than waiting for a battalion commander miles behind the line. The most dramatic demonstration of this new American instinct came during German counterattacks. In the old army, counterattacks were slow affairs, requiring senior approval. At Fort Benning, lieutenants were taught that counterattacks must happen within minutes or they were worthless. The Sicily campaign proved this doctrine decisively. German thrusts that expected a 3-hour American delay met 30-second American reactions. This shocked the Germans. Reports from Panzer Grenadier units repeatedly described American infantry as fast-moving fire brigades, a phrase that would later appear again in Normandy and the Ardennes. It was not that American troops were inherently superior. It was that Fort Benning had equipped them with mental habits that matched the tempo of modern mechanized warfare. By the end of the Sicily campaign, the U.S. Army had demonstrated something the British, Germans, and even many American officers had not believed possible just a year earlier. An American infantry force capable of rapid, decentralized maneuver and lightning counterattacks executed by junior leaders without waiting for permission from above. This was the moment the world first saw Fort Benning's revolution in action. But the real test, the one that would reshape the European war, was still ahead. In the hedgerows of Normandy and freezing forests of the Ardennes, American units would face situations far more chaotic than Sicily, and the doctrine born at Fort Benning would become the U.S. Army's greatest battlefield advantage.
When American soldiers stormed ashore on June 6, 1944, the chaos of Normandy immediately exposed any army that relied on slow, centralized decision-making. The Vosges country behind Omaha and Utah Beach, the hedgerows of Normandy, was a maze of sunken lanes, earthen embankments, blind corners, and kill zones crafted by centuries of farming. No battlefield in Europe punished hesitation more brutally. A platoon that stopped for even 30 seconds could be flanked and destroyed. A company that waited for battalion orders could be pinned down all morning. In this environment, the U.S. Army's greatest advantage was not equipment or numbers, but leadership flexibility, the very skill set Fort Benning had spent years building. Every day in Normandy, junior officers were forced into situations where they faced incomplete intelligence, severed communications, and rapidly shifting threats. And every day, they made decisions that saved their men. When a hedgerow ambush cut down a squad, the platoon leader didn't wait for higher command. He immediately launched a local counterattack around the flank. When a German MG-42 opened fire from a farmhouse, a corporal took a fire team, maneuvered without orders, and neutralized the position. This was exactly what Marshall and Bradley had designed the Benning system to produce. leaders who could instinctively seize initiative. What stunned German commanders in Normandy was the speed of these American reactions. Wehrmacht doctrine depended on hitting the Allies hard, then exploiting the inevitable pause as American units reorganized under orders. But the Americans no longer paused. A German platoon from the 352nd Infantry Division reported after capture that U.S. infantry counterattacked immediately before we could reset our machine guns. Another from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division complained that American squads acted in small groups independently, like hunters. These observations echoed the Sicily reports almost word for word. In the weeks after D-Day, U.S. units repeatedly demonstrated the decentralized decision cycle Fort Benning had perfected. At Carentan, paratroopers and infantry companies repelled German counterattacks by launching their own rapid local counter-thrusts, often within minutes of enemy contact. At St. Lo, as hedgerow fighting reached its peak, company commanders improvised combined arms breaching tactics, pairing tanks and infantry at angles never mentioned in any manual, simply because the terrain demanded it. The Army later turned these battlefield improvisations into doctrine, but in June and July 1944, they were acts of decentralized genius by officers and NCOs shaped by Fort Benning. Then came the test that would prove decisively that the U.S. Army had become the fastest organizing infantry force on the Western Front, the German Ardennes Offensive, December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. The initial German attack created total chaos. U.S. units were scattered, communications collapsed, fog and snow obscured visibility, and entire battalions lost contact with their regiments. The Wehrmacht expected the U.S. Army to crumble just as it had at Kasserine, giving German armored spearheads time to capture key crossroads before the Americans could react. But the Americans of 1942 were not the Americans of 1944. It was an army built on Fort Benning's doctrine of fast, decentralized action. The most important battles of the Ardennes, Elsenborn Ridge, Crinkled Roquerat, St. Vith, and Bastogne, were won not by perfect coordination from the top, but by extraordinary speed of decision at the bottom. Platoon leaders in the 99th Infantry Division at Elsenborn held their ground against the 12th SS Panzer Division by launching immediate micro-counterattacks whenever German infantry tried to infiltrate. Company commanders in the 2nd Division reorganized shattered lines in minutes, not hours. The 101st Airborne at Bastogne improvised defensive plans as fast as German probe attacks shifted direction, with officers shuffling units across town and woods in the dark, often without radio contact. German after-action reports revealed their shock. The Americans reacted so quickly that the usual German tactic, probe, exploit hesitation, envelop the flank, failed again and again. General Lettwitz of 4XL7 Panzer Corps noted with frustration that American infantry formed fire brigades at every threat, a phrase identical to descriptions of U.S. behavior in Sicily and Normandy. These fire brigades were not special units. They were ordinary platoons and companies led by officers who had been trained at Fort Benning to think for themselves. Perhaps the clearest example of Fort Benning's influence came during the desperate early hours at Crinkled Roquerat, where scattered American units, many reduced to ad hoc platoons, held back repeated assaults by veteran German armor and infantry. They shifted positions, counterattacked locally, and created overlapping fields of fire without waiting for higher command. One German officer later remarked, "We could never find the American flank because they always moved it before we arrived." This was pure Fort Benning doctrine: flexibility, initiative, speed. By the end of the Bulge, German commanders had reached a consensus that U.S. small unit leaders were the most reactive and fast-thinking of any army they faced on the Western Front. Not the most armed, not the most experienced, but the fastest at adapting to shock. American divisions that should have been annihilated instead slowed, stalled, and eventually reversed the German offensive because their leadership culture allowed them to reorganize under fire quicker than the Germans could exploit their breakthroughs. In the winter forests of the Ardennes, the revolution Marshall began at Fort Benning reached its pinnacle. the U.S. Army fought through the greatest surprise attack it would face in the European War, and survived because platoons and companies were led by men who did not freeze when the world collapsed around them. They made decisions. They counterattacked. They moved faster than the enemy. The secret behind America's lightning counterattacks was no longer just doctrine. It had become instinct, a reflex forged at Fort Benning and proven on the most dangerous battlefields of World War II. By the final months of the war in Europe, American counterattacks had become so fast, so synchronized, and so relentlessly aggressive that German officers began asking the same question during POW interrogations. How were U.S. infantry units recovering and striking back faster than any force they had faced? Not only faster than the British, but faster than the German army itself. The answer, confirmed again and again in Allied interrogation summaries, was that American platoons and companies were led by officers trained in a system fundamentally different from the one the Wehrmacht had expected. Those officers came out of Fort Benning, carrying with them the doctrine George Marshall had carved into the DNA of the wartime U.S. Army. What German reports described in battlefield language, fire brigades, elastic reaction, immediate counterattack, were all deliberate outcomes of the Benning Revolution. German officers accustomed to fighting rigid Soviet formations or carefully orchestrated British units suddenly found themselves facing American squads that acted with independent initiative, as if each one understood the entire battlefield. A captured officer from the 12th SS Panzer Division, one of the most elite and experienced formations in the Wehrmacht, admitted that U.S. infantry units recovered from surprise with unnatural speed, a direct result of Fort Benning's decision under pressure training. During the fighting in the Ardennes, a staff officer from LXVVI Corps noted bitterly, "American units reformed and attacked before we finished probing them." This was a stark contrast to German expectations. Wehrmacht doctrine assumed that the enemy needed hours to regain organization after a shock. But U.S. platoons, drilled at Benning to react instantly, often counterattacked within 5 to 10 minutes, sometimes even faster. In the fog-shrouded forests of the Schnee Eifel, this ability repeatedly thwarted German infiltration tactics. At night, American squads launched immediate flanking actions when ambushed, catching German patrols off guard. These were not chance behaviors. They were the physical manifestation of Fort Benning's most important teaching. When the enemy hits you, do not retreat. Hit back harder and faster before he stabilizes. German officers marveled at the speed with which American units delegated authority downward. In many cases, U.S. NCOs acted with the confidence of German junior officers, and U.S. lieutenants behaved with the autonomy of German captains. This phenomenon confused German intelligence analysts, who struggled to map American chains of command because actions on the ground often appeared disconnected from higher headquarters, but were in fact perfectly aligned with the commander's intent. One German after-action analysis concluded, American infantry is decentralized to a degree that makes prediction impossible. This unpredictability was one of the greatest psychological weapons the U.S. Army possessed. Another revelation from POW reports was the extraordinary competence of American company commanders. In Normandy, Sicily, and the Ardennes, German units noted that U.S. companies functioned as cohesive, self-directed combat teams even when cut off from battalion command. This was no accident. Fort Benning had intentionally elevated the role of command company, teaching captains to think not as administrators, but as battlefield tacticians responsible for maneuver, fire coordination, and counterattack timing. Many of these officers were barely in their mid-20s, yet they controlled complex combined arms actions with a maturity that shocked German observers. By early 1945, German commanders in the West began using a phrase that appeared repeatedly in their intelligence logs: Amerikanische Stoßtruppe, American assault troops. They were not referring to Rangers or airborne units, but to ordinary infantry companies whose ability to break contact, reorganize, and counterstrike seemed, in German words, like specialized shock troops. It was the ultimate proof that Benning's doctrine had created not just better officers, but an entire culture of battlefield adaptability. When German POWs were asked which Allied army reacted fastest on the battlefield, the answer was consistent: the Americans. British units were steady and disciplined, but slower. Soviet units were aggressive, but often careless and centralized. American infantry, if led by Benning-trained officers, combined speed, intelligence, and controlled aggression in a way no other force had matched. The Wehrmacht, for all its combat experience, was often forced into defensive postures simply because U.S. platoons acted before German units finished deploying. One of the most telling statements came from a German major captured near Cologne in March 1945. He told Allied interrogators, "Your small unit leaders were your greatest weapon. We could defeat your tanks, your artillery, but we could not defeat the speed of your decision-making." That speed was born at Fort Benning. Historians today often focus on American industry, logistics, and firepower as the keys to Allied victory. And those factors mattered enormously. But the Germans, who fought the Americans face-to-face, pointed to something else: the way American officers and NCOs made decisions under fire, the way they counterattacked instantly, the way they maneuvered with initiative rather than waiting for orders. In other words, the Wehrmacht believed the U.S. Army's greatest battlefield advantage came not from weapons, but from leadership. Leadership built by George C. Marshall. Leadership forged at Fort Benning. Leadership that turned the U.S. Army into the fastest-moving, fastest-reacting infantry force of the Second World War. This was the secret behind America's lightning counterattacks. Not magic, not luck, but a revolutionary doctrine that empowered ordinary soldiers to make extraordinary decisions. And in the crucible of North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and the Ardennes, that doctrine reshaped the course of the war.